Hello, and welcome to the AAMFT podcast, your all-access pass to the latest news, developments, and thought leaders in the world of systemic therapy. We strive to relate, educate, and innovate, one episode at a time. I'm your host, Dr. Eli Karam, and we're brought to you by the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. Our podcast explores topics that relationship-based therapists care about. In addition to featuring unique conversations and interviews with established experts, our show provides information and education on direct practice and emerging trends in the MFT profession. For more information, please visit us at aamft.org. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Dr. Eli Karam back with you on the AAMFT podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Today, a topic near and dear to every MFT's heart, clinical supervision. Where we've been, where we're going, and what makes MFT supervision unique from almost every other mental health discipline. Not only in the training supervisors need in order to be considered an AAMFT Approved Supervisor, but also in the type of supervision that therapists in training get. Who better to talk to that with than Dr. Toni Zimmerman? She is an expert on all things AAMFT supervision. Toni is a professor at Colorado State University in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies. She has directed the CSU Family Therapy program for almost 25 years. The program is nationally recognized for its training emphasis on equality inclusion on all society levels, from the most intimate of relationships, including family and friends, to larger communities and our global responsibility to work for human rights and justice. Dr. Zimmerman has received many awards during her academic career, including a University Distinguished Teaching Scholar, Therapist and Supervisor of the Year from the state of Colorado, and a Distinguished Faculty Alumni Award. Toni and her collaborators have received numerous awards and recognition for their research and community initiatives, including the Exceptional Innovative Instruction for Service Learning Faculty Award and the Community Engagement Award through CSU. She has a national reputation for her research on equality, but really today she's going to tell us all about trends in MFT supervision. The AAMFT uses Toni frequently in their training of supervisors and supervisor candidates. She is a staple in the Fundamentals of Supervision training program. We will talk a little bit about that, and then after the interview, I'll be back to share some user-friendly resources with you if you are interested in becoming an AAMFT Approved Supervisor. Without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Dr. Toni Zimmerman. I always like to start out talking about someone's origin story, Toni. How did you get involved in wanting to be a supervisor and then a trainer of MFT supervision?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I love talking about supervision. It's very near and dear to my heart, and I feel like it's central to the field of MFT's good quality supervision. And for me, I really enjoyed my supervision when I was in training. And what I really liked about it was just the collaboration. I mean, we think about systems in terms of client and therapist, but including in a very meaningful way the supervisor into that system to make sure we have multiple perspectives. We're not practicing in isolation, missing things, not seeing things from a certain angle. Just that attention to larger systems. I like to, both as a therapist, but as a supervisor, to not only be thinking about patterns and cycles in terms of the client, but really looking at patterns and cycles with the therapist as well as between the therapist and supervisor, really attending to those systems, looking at power dynamics, just that collaboration. I just find that very enjoyable and meaningful, and I think everyone benefits, the client benefits for sure from multiple perspectives. And then when I went on to be a faculty member after my PhD, that was part of my therapy or part of my faculty position, which I was thrilled about. So I am the program director at Colorado State University. I've been doing that ever since I came out of my doctoral program.
Yeah,
So
it's kind of been built into your job description from the start. And you said so many things, and I believe that the parallel processes, the isomorphic processes that goes on between, a young therapist in training learning to do therapy and how that is replicated in a supervision group. I couldn't agree with you more. And many young professionals will tell you they learned as much, if not more, from their supervisor or their peers in group supervision as they ever did in the classroom. So it's certainly something that is vital all throughout the process of MFT training. And one of those things that differentiates MFT from the other major mental health disciplines is how we do supervision and the priority. And that's one of the things I'm going to ask you in a second about in the years you've been doing this, the changes that you've seen. But one of the things that is kind of constant is our belief in live supervision, especially, and watching the work being done and getting feedback. So, I mean, it's great to see that you've been doing that. What are, would you say, some of the biggest changes you've seen since you've started in the field and doing MFT supervision?
Well, there are many changes, but what stands out to me is the attention to power differentials in society, families, couples, really paying attention to privilege, our own privilege, marginalization. I think it's imperative for therapists and supervisors to actively be talking about their own backgrounds as well as the background of their clients and what impact that's had. An example of that would be, when we think about race, class, sexual orientation, religion, ethnicity, so many. There is a significant difference. I'm white. I'm Euro-American. There's a difference in being white and being non-white in our everyday world and in our society. And to pay attention, just as an example with race, to pay attention to what that means in a person's lived experience. I think for me that is the most important, and we need to continue to further that work. When you're working with a client, to really pay attention to, I call it privilege mapping, to really look at yourself. What are the areas of privilege that you have? We all have areas of privilege. And what are the areas that for you, the supervisor, the client, are marginalized? So that you have a sense almost like privilege mapping. Who are we here? And what impact might that have had on our lives and our therapy?
How does a supervisor make a supervisee more aware of that dynamic, Toni?
Well, I think the big thing is that the literature tells us that if we don't bring it up in supervision, it's unlikely to be brought up. So as supervisors, it shouldn't be an add-on, but really central to our conversations. And I think being a good listener and asking questions so that supervisees have opportunities to do some self of the therapist, to talk about their own backgrounds as well as the backgrounds of their client. And for instance, with your example, if the supervisor was of a more privileged place, let's say white, and the supervisee is non-white, as our example, it's really important for a supervisor to not be colorblind. What we want and what is are two different things. What we want is equality, shared power. What we want is we don't want there to be disparities in all major institutions, health, judicial, education. But we know that there are disparities in all major institutions between white and non-white. So when we know that the lived experience of a non-white person is going to be different than the lived experience of a white person. So when we don't acknowledge that, we become colorblind, entering the room as if everyone has had access to social capital in the same way. So recognizing and listening are so imperative. That's the first thing, is to recognize where your privileges are in comparison, so that you're staying attuned to that and talking about that and having room for that. Believing and being educated on disparities on all kinds of dimensions, gender, religion, all kinds of dimensions. A supervisor just simply must be educated about disparities, social justice. It's central to your job. And then to know how to bring that in a way that lets all stories be present, and that no one in the room, whether that's supervisors or whether that's clients, becomes some kind of a single story, a stereotype. And you have to create a very safe space in order for that to happen.
And one of the great things about supervision is we're just saying, rather than just talking about that dynamic as it pertains to a case of your supervisee, you can actually talk about that in the room with you and your supervisee or supervisees as it relates to you as a supervisor in a position of power, or maybe with a different ethnic or socioeconomic background than the student you're working with.
That's right. It's a natural environment. It happens in a very organic way if we keep it central. And I also think whether it's in individual or group supervision, this is an area that we're all learning more and more. And it's a place that you can never really arrive. You just have to keep learning from each other, from the literature. And so people are going to make mistakes in this area. And so if somebody says something that is offensive or just a lack of knowledge, I think it's really important for supervisors to call people in supervision. Don't call them out. And so when you call people out, I think it shuts people down. It leads to embarrassment and defensiveness. And so really to be good at calling people in and just saying things like, I can see why you think that, because we're really all taught to think that way. Here's what I've learned. And then to give some resources. And then if you make a mistake as a supervisor, you say something that was not thoughtful, or it was out of your awareness, to also not be defensive and to say, gosh, thank you for bringing that into my awareness. I hadn't thought about it that way. And then to do just a quick repair.
Well, this kind of flows into something, and we can keep talking about some emerging trends as we go on, that I thought about asking you too, is about having difficult conversations with supervisors. Much like if a client is having a problem with a therapist, there is a tear in the alliance. As therapists, we don't want them to never come back and us not to know it. We want them to address the tear. So let's say I am a supervisee. How do I have what is a difficult conversation if I have a tear in my alliance with a supervisor and a person of power, or if they're not meeting my clinical or training needs? How would you advise young people how to have that dialogue, whether they're in their MFT master's or doctoral program, or they're out in the field working on licensure?
Oh, I think that's such a great question, because as we know, when you have injuries in a relationship, in the person that has more power, which is the supervisor, generally is the person that needs to put out a sincere welcome mat. And so, for instance, if a supervisee is feeling hurt or frustrated by, or not heard, whatever it might be, by a supervisor, I think it's the supervisor's job from the very beginning, for instance, when you're first contracting with a supervisee, to talk about how will we have difficult conversations right from the beginning, and to talk about calling in and, what I kind of term as calling in and not calling out, or how will we repair. To talk about that right at the beginning, and then to invite it all along the way. So for instance, I'll say often at the end of supervision, I like to use the word clear-ups. was there anything that went on today that we need to clear up on? And for instance, you might be in group supervision and it might be one supervisee said something that another supervisee is holding and really wanting to say, hey, when you said something about, this piece around religion, I'm from that background, that didn't sit well with me. And then really inviting everyone to say, God, thank you for pointing that out. I hear you, and that makes a difference to me.
So don't wait till it's a clear, glaring problem. You build it into the structure of your supervision to give feedback at the end. So if it's normalized from the beginning, it's easier to cut these disconnects or these tears off at the pass. I really like that. And do you think there's that's harder to do in a group setting where you don't know how people are going to take it versus a one-on-one setting with a student and a supervisor?
I think it's different because you're managing multiple perspectives, but I think these are wonderful opportunities to role model how this happens in therapy. There's injuries between people in therapy, couples and families, and between persons in therapy and the therapist. And so supervision is a great opportunity to normalize that and to effectively, non-defensively work through that.
Yeah, wonderfully said. Other trends that you have really seen or changes that you have seen, over the last 20, 25 years of doing this work?
Well, certainly another change is technology, the use of technology, what we're doing right now. Supervisors, well, for instance, you talked about at the beginning about how live supervision is such a hallmark so that we're not just getting the report of what happened in a therapy session, although that is certainly a hallmark as well, case consultation, but to really see the dynamics. And so for many years, I think we only thought of the one-way mirror as a way to do that. But now with HIPAA-compliant platforms, you can certainly do that in so many ways. You can have a supervisor and a supervision session online with one or multiple people. You can be hours away from somebody. You have to pay attention to things like state regulations in that way. And also if a person is at an agency, let's say you're at an agency but you're hiring me and I don't work for the agency as your supervisor, we have to pay attention to things like that in terms of technology and what's allowed. But what is available now is so sophisticated in comparison. And we used to think that in the postgraduate world, live supervision was, unless you happened to have a one-way mirror, was really something that was over for you after training. And that just certainly is not the case. And when I do my training in supervision, I talk to people about continuing to have opportunities to do live supervision. I mean, I can be in my office, watch, somebody an hour away can be doing not only a supervision on a HIPAA-compliant platform, but even a session that I can watch. And the client, of course, would know my supervisor's on the other end. You can even introduce them. The person can even step out of the room halfway and call the supervisor to do that break in the middle. I mean, all of that can happen in ways that were not available before. And it's really important that we utilize that.
Supervision is in the scope of practice of MFTs, but it needs to be in the scope of competence, meaning you have to know your stuff. You have to be HIPAA compliant. You have to know the technology before you use it. And I think that requires the supervisor to really stay up to date. And you giving these kind of cutting edge training on supervision, how would you recommend to somebody that has been supervising in a while but is still reticent of adapting to new technology, but other fields in our field is, increasingly headed in that direction. So how do you kind of increase your scope of competence? How do you get caught up to speed on these emerging trends with video supervision and accompanying technology?
Well, I think what you're pointing out is so important. It is it is important for somebody who's going to be a supervisor, AAMFT Approved Supervisor, to stay up on what is happening in the literature and in the field. And certainly one of those is technology changes. And so I think you can, if you're reticent, I think you can do a couple things. One is to reach out to somebody who does this on a regular basis. For instance, getting the name of some supervisors that do the majority of their supervision online to get some advice and maybe even to practice. So before you jump in with a supervisee or a live case with a client where the supervisee calls you halfway or something like that, to practice it with a colleague. Okay, I'm coming in, let's pretend we're doing supervision, let's pretend I'm watching a case, let me try the different bells and whistles so that you are more comfortable. And the supervisor needs to get comfortable with the platform and then introduce it into their contract. I'd like to use this platform. Here's the paperwork that we could use in terms of having the agency sign off or the client sign off. I feel confident as a supervisor that I have selected a HIPAA compliant platform, all those kinds of things, and then, jump in.
How do you do it at Colorado State and also in your trainings across the country as far as incorporate technology into the training of future MFT supervisors?
Well, I work within a training program, and our setup has 6 one-way mirrors. I can be in one room, and I have mirrors surrounding me. Yeah, it's a pretty wonderful setup. And so the way we work is, for instance, we have a supervisor who is assigned to each night that the center is. We have run actually 3 centers. We run a trauma center, a traditional therapy center, and a program called Campus Connections, which is therapeutic mentoring. So we have many things. All of our 500 hours happen right on our campus in our program. And so let's say I'm the Monday night supervisor. I meet at 3:00 with everyone who's going to see clients that night, and we case plan. And then they all have a case at 4, 5, 6, and 7. So many, many cases are happening, and I am moving from mirror to mirror. They're all taking a break halfway. Some mirrors I'm going to watch much longer because we know that that's a more, a higher need case. Some not as long. So at CSU, we use that live mirror model, and it's very easy in that setting. We also have every student records every session, and then they're required to review their sessions for a certain number of hours every week and reflect on that. And then, so often training programs, unless they happen to be an online training program, are generally not using as much. The technology tends to be different. Some programs, for instance, you record and you do, you're watching video. But I think when it becomes even more important is post-grad.
Oh, I have a bunch of questions for you about that, in the sense that, when you're in a training program, you're in the kind of furtive nest of your program. It's provided for you. And a lot of times you don't have a say over your supervisor. You're assigned this or there. And when you're in the field, and a lot of people listening to this podcast will be what AAMFT calls preclinical fellows, working towards licensure now in the real world. And they may be the only MFT at their site, and they usually will have to go out and get supervision. So instead of having it assigned to them, now becomes a choice. You are interviewing the supervisor. So I wanted to ask you about, what do you think in interviewing a potential supervisor, what are appropriate and what is not appropriate to ask and kind of assess for fit?
Oh, I just think that's great what you're saying. It's that when you leave the nest in a way, right, where everything is provided and you have hopefully have had multiple supervisors throughout your training that are right there associated with the program. So when you enter that post-grad supervision, I think so many things are important for you to think about. you're obviously, going out and looking for a job, and that job could be in an agency, just like you said. And if there's an MFT at that agency, boy, that's great. Then you're really wanting to ask yourself two questions. One is, what credentials do I need my supervisor to have so that I can move towards licensure, things like that are the logistics, the very important pieces of moving forward in my profession. But secondly, who would be the best fit for me? And sometimes that means hiring extra supervision, somebody that's in private practice, or even, whatever that might look like in your state. Often there are state regulations about going out, having supervision in another state. So you have to pay attention to those things. Some supervisors are licensed in multiple states and can offer that, but you really want to look at your state regulations. So once you know that the person's credentials are lined up with AAMFT and the state, then you're really asking yourself, what do I want at this? What do I need at this juncture in my training? For some people, they're really wanting to hone in on a very specific theory, for instance. So they want to hire an EFT supervisor, or so they're very theory-based. Others might say, I really want to work with somebody who is in private practice because maybe I'm in an agency now, but I'm interested in that later. So I'd like to have a private practice perspective. I think it's important to think about what are your goals.
And that could be different for everybody else. And I know we teach a course in my accredited program, a capstone course, preparing you for post-graduation. And we have that talk about what are you looking for? And some students, the reality, or emerging professional, the reality is money is tight. So they are thinking more of how much this will cost me, or what is the easiest way to do it, which is not always, counterintuitive to what we've been talking about, is finding someone that's a good fit for you. If you want to develop your clinical skill, or you want to be mentored in moving towards private practice, those things trump what the cost is. But I think young professionals have a hard time knowing, well, what can I ask? And, you can say this as you do the AAMFT training and you help supervisors in training develop their theory of supervision, so to speak. I think it's important for students to know how a potential supervisor would supervise, what they believe about therapy, how they do. So we talk about asking potential therapist in training to interview their supervisor by looking at their theory of supervision. So I'm curious what you think about that. Also curious about the biggest anxiety I think we've found is negotiating a price point of what supervision costs and how to have that conversation as an emerging professional with a supervisor. If you could comment on those two things, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, and this is just such a critical point you're bringing up. To be aware of young professionals, many who are just getting started, and cost is a significant issue. Many of them are coming out of school even with school loans and things like that. So I think being sensitive to the price is critical. If you are fortunate enough to get an agency job where that is right, where that's a part of that, then that is likely no cost, and that might even influence how you look for a job so that you don't have to think about that. If you're in a situation where you find a job, it's the job you want, you really like working for this agency, but you do have to go out for that supervision, then I think you can do things to offset those costs. For instance, like group supervision, join a group. And again, that HIPAA compliant platform makes that easier because you can build a group from multiple people at multiple agencies and to interview and ask about that. For instance, you might have somebody who's reluctant to use that technology, and there's, they don't see people that drive more than an hour or something like that. So I think it's important to be a careful consumer, not only to quality and fit, but also cost. When you're looking for an approved supervisor, many people go to the AAMFT Supervisor Directory to see who's in my state, who's available. You have to, as an approved supervisor, you have to say, I want to be on that list. And so sometimes there's people in your area that are not on that list. And so talking to supervisors to find out who they know is doing supervision, really doing your homework to see. I think it's easy to feel like, oh my gosh, there's only one person, or there's only two people, and there's often more than that. So really finding out, first of all, who is available and who has space available to take on more supervisees. What's the cost? Can that be offset with group or dyad? And obviously a mix of those things.
You also brought up, I think it's very important, sometimes as a young professional, you're just trying to move forward in your career, think of the next thing. You're not thinking of the difference between AAMFT Approved Supervision, as we've mentioned several times, and other MFT Supervision. And some younger listeners might not know, over the last about 6 years, AAMFT has really taken the reins back over supervision training for quality control and for continuity. And as I said, you have been one of the leaders in that effort who AAMFT looks to train future supervisors. Can you talk about the advantages of AAMFT supervision over non-AAMFT MFT supervision?
Yeah, and you alluded to it at the beginning that this is a really standout difference in our field. That for a very long time, MFT has had a designation as an approved supervisor, and that was really there was no other field doing that. There was a very specific set of what you need to do to get that designation. And for some listeners, they might not know that requires you, if you want to become an AAMFT supervisor, you're going to need to take a 30-hour class on supervision. And that class can be online through AAMFT. It can also be at the conference. The annual conference. There's many ways to take that course, but you want to start with AAMFT because that's the hub of getting this 30-hour course. You're also going to, over 18 months or 2 years, you're not only going to be doing supervision, but you're also going to have a supervisor mentor. So in order to get that accreditation or that designation, you're going to supervise 180 hours, like I said, over an 18-month or 2-year period, and you're going to be getting 36 hours of meeting with somebody who's already an approved supervisor to get mentoring about how to be an excellent supervisor. And that's about a 5-to-1 ratio. You're also going to write a philosophy of supervision paper, which is part of that 30-hour course, to really think out, what is my philosophy? What do I, what is it about doing supervision that I want to be able to not only articulate, but practice? All of those regulations are in the AAMFT Supervisor's Handbook. The clock starts on that designation when you identify your supervisor mentor, and then you have a contract with them. We're going to meet for 36 hours over this time period. I'm going to be supervising people in my agency or at my private practice, whatever that might be. So that is really meaningful and thoughtful training.
Yeah, you did a beautiful job of laying out what it takes to be a supervisor. And that's what I tell young professionals too. It's like, a lot of times you get what you pay for. When you are getting an AAMFT supervisor, you have an assurance that they've really wanted it. This is not something that is just handed out, or in other fields. In other fields, you can be a supervisor. The only requirement is a certain length of time you've been licensed or practicing. You have to really want it. If you are a practitioner, you and I are both practitioners and academic MFTs, and it's kind of built into being in a training program, being a supervisor. But if we're thinking of people listening that say, hey, I want to give back. I'm a frontline clinician, and I don't want to be an academic, but the supervision is this, I always think of this beautiful place in between the front line of being a clinician and being in the classroom, and we need good supervisors out there. So it is a labor of love, but I think the other thing, and you were alluding to this, I can remember some of my best times as both doing supervision, but before getting mentored. It is what you get out of it as a supervisor. You talk about really how it has enriched you as a person, as a supervisor, to do that work. What does a supervisor get out? Because a lot of our talk today has been about, what a young professional can get out of good quality AAMFT supervision, but what does the supervisor get back from their time and their service?
Oh, I really love that you're asking that. I really think about it so much the way you just said, generativity. I think that when you've been in the field, you're licensed, I would encourage so many people to take this great step to become an AAMFT Approved Supervisor so that you can play a role in the next generation of MFTs. You have a lot of experience. You want to share that in a generativity way. I also think what you get out of it is lifelong learning. I think that it's critical for therapists and supervisors to not stop learning when you leave school. You want to stay up on the literature, the field, all sorts of things. And I think that when you are in supervision, you're going to be supervising people that maybe just came out of a program and they're talking about things that maybe you don't know so much about. And rather than being intimidated by that, to learn with them. If they're talking about certain concepts that aren't as familiar to you, to be able to just be authentic and say, I'm not as familiar with that, but I'm gonna learn more about that. Thanks for bringing that up. So I think ongoing learning, generativity, the opportunity to give back, I think all these things are really important. And I might also mention that in addition to the training, which it is a commitment, there's no question, but it's much of it is what you would be doing anyway, beginning to supervise people, getting mentoring, things like that. So it's not a hurdle that is, AAMFT does a great job of not making the hurdle to become an AAMFT supervisor so large that people don't want to do that. I think they hit it just right with what you need to do to be a really high quality supervisor with a reasonable number of tasks to get there. But once you are designated, I love that AAMFT requires that you take a refresher course every 5 years. So I don't know that some of the listeners know that, but every 5 years, for myself too, as an approved supervisor, I take a refresher course, which is 5 hours, to make sure I'm paying attention to what's happening in the field and all sorts of things in terms of supervision. And that gives me the opportunity to learn from other supervisors that have been in the field, because generally you take that in a group setting, online or in person.
I mean, I can't echo enough. I re-upped mine last year at the national conference, and it made me, back to this kind of one of these words we've been using today, it's an intentional practice, as you're right, that good therapists do anyway. It made me think about, revise my philosophy of supervision, as you were mentioning, think about how I practice my supervision and how that is similar or different to the way I do therapy, and hear from my peers. So in our closing moments here, what else do you think is important, both for people looking for supervision or potential MFTs looking to start their own track into becoming a supervisor? What other tips or important things, or things in the future that are on the horizon you think are important to consider?
Well, one thing is that states all across the country, states have adapted. They have matched, many states have matched requirements for supervisors at the state level to look like the designation. So AAMFT has, the AAMFT Approved Supervision Designation has highly influenced what states require now. Now, some states require very little. For instance, the state that I live in, Colorado, there's not a state requirement to do anything beyond being a licensed professional. But other states, many states across the country, require a 30-hour class, mentoring, all the things that are part of that designation. So that designation has been just has moved right into the fabric of many, many states' regulations. And so it's often I find people coming to become an AAMFT supervisor because they want to supervise and looked, in their own state, have looked at those state regulations and said, wow, it looks like my state is saying to me, if I get that designation, I'm good to go supervising in my state. So it's always good to look at both state and national.
It really is the gold standard. You will not, when you get to the licensure level, most states, yes, they recognize that. You will not have to verify what you got and how it was delivered. Whereas if you go to a non-AAMFT supervisor on the licensure level in the state licensing boards, there's a lot more gray areas and things open for question. So I think it eliminates a lot of anxiety for potential licensees as they move towards the end of that process if they've gotten AAMFT supervision.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really is a parallel process.
Yeah. It was so great talking to you, Toni. You are always very personable and active at AAMFT events, the national conference, and I imagine you are continuing to do training. So if somebody comes to get that 30 hours, as you mentioned, how often are you doing that for AAMFT?
I tend to do it at the national conference, which I just really love doing it. It gives me an opportunity to interact with what I call the valedictorians of the around the country, and also people from around the world. In my most recent training that I did at the annual conference, we had professionals from Hong Kong and China. So that is just a wonderful thing. And many of the people that are in that class are those people that really want to take that next step, that generativity. And it's exciting for me to not only teach the class, but to learn from all of them. I also recently taught the class at the AAMFT home base there
at headquarters in Alexandria.
Yeah, headquarters, and that was wonderful to go to what I call the mothership. So I was able to go to the mothership and teach the course there, and that was just wonderful this summer. So it's something I completely enjoy and have a lot of passion around.
Well, I can tell, and I can tell your passion has come through our conversation. And I appreciate all you do for MFT Supervision, for the profession, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you again, Toni. So much good information, and what a great dialogue back and forth about current trends in MFT Supervision. If you are out there and you've listened to this and you say, hey, I'm an LMFT, I want to give back, I am not an academic, I'm not going to teach a class, but there is something about working with young clinicians and mentoring that is appealing to me. Well, perhaps you would be a good candidate to become an AAMFT Approved Supervisor. Let me tell you about the Fundamentals course. As part of the application process, MFTs who are either AAMFT Clinical Fellows or AAMFT Preclinical Fellows must complete a 30-credit-hour Fundamentals of Supervision course in order to receive the AAMFT Approved Supervisor Designation. And this is a course comprised of a 15-credit didactic portion and a 15-credit interactive portion. And that goes along with a personal philosophy of supervision paper, your theory of supervision, so to speak. That paper is to be completed after both of the course components are finished and is evaluated by a didactic course instructor from the AAMFT. The complete course with both the didactic and the interactive have to be completed within 18 months of registration. AAMFT wants you to know this is a rigorous course. It is not a workshop. It is not a formality. It requires reading, really developing a theory of supervision, discussion post online, short assignments. It is a class. More about this, you go to aamft.org, your one-stop shop. At the top there's a pull-down menu that says Enhanced Knowledge. You can click on there, and you will see Approved Supervisor Resources. And in there is this description of the standards I just went over, and including the Standards Handbook that has everything updated. You can also go there if you've been supervising for a while, and you're like, hey, when is my 5-year refresher due? There is plenty of information on that as well. All right. As always, you know I love hearing from you, the listener. Our topics are informed by the feedback I get from you. I've gotten a lot of great feedback lately from some co-AAMFT programs that are using the podcast in their courses. And certainly we also get information and feedback from people out there that aren't even part of the AAMFT, but they're interested in systemic therapy, working with couples or families, or even individuals from a systemic framework. Love to hear from you. Easiest way to get a hold of us, drop us a line, communications@aamft.org. You can also reach me directly at info@elikaram, ELIKARAM.com. The Twitter handle is @the-AAMFT. I'm at Dr. Eli Live. #AAMFT Podcast. Find us wherever you find your favorite podcast. I like the Apple Podcast. Please leave us a star rating and a review. That really helps. And you can catch up on all the back episodes on AAMFT.org. Until next time, my friends, stay systemic.